Okay, let's go ahead and begin. We are in the final lesson of this quarter of the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness. The final one, we're going to be in Joshua chapters 1 through 5 today. Joshua chapter 1 is where we're going to begin. And as we have been looking in the last couple of lessons at the sermons that Moses has preached on the plains of Moab, he has died, and Joshua has taken over as the leader. And today he's really going to be solidified as that leader as we cross over to the Jordan River. It's kind of confusing, when I think about the wilderness wandering in that period. I don't think of any part of Joshua being in it. And really the reason that we do that this way is because they cross over, and when they cross over, the manna is going to stop. And we're going to see that in chapter 5. The manna will stop when they eat of the land. And that's really where we have decided to put the separation between this and the invasion and conquest. And just for your information, I like to know this. Next quarter, which starts on a week from today, I think it's Tracy Moyers and Micah Clem is going to be your teachers. So do with that what you decide with. Okay. So in Joshua chapter 1, we're going to have the Lord encourage Joshua to really take the reins of where Moses left off. These are big shoes to fill. We're in Abel Shittim is where we are, right on the edge of crossing over into Jericho. We have been there for a while at Abel Shittim. It is where I think they were there when we have the sin of Balaam and Balak, that story. I think the Israelites were camped there. So they are still camped at Abel Shittim is where they are. And I want you to notice, I saw over and over and over again this text in verse 6 and verse 7, verse 9, and in verse 18. He is told the Lord tells Joshua, and then the people also are going to tell him, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. Look in verse 9. It says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous, do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord God is with you wherever you go. So, God is encouraging him, is going to encourage him. Be strong and courageous. It's similar to back in Deuteronomy 31. This same phrasing is used, be strong and courageous. It's used in verse 6, 7, and in 23, or the ones I saw. There could be more than that. And those times, I think it's Moses talking to the people to be strong and courageous. And so this concept, the text is emphasizing that they need to be bold when they enter the land. Do you remember, and I'm sure you do, back at Kadesh Barnea 40 years ago here in this text, what happened? The older generation was not strong, was not courageous, and they did not go into the land. And it was because of that they were not allowed to go in. Remember what they said? They said, we can't go in. There's walled cities. They're fortified cities. There's giants in the land. And so God's telling the people, and he's telling Joshua, you need to be courageous. You're going into this land, and I'm going to be with you in every place and everywhere that you go. I will be there as well. And he also encourages him to keep the law. If you look in verse 8, he says, the book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night. So that you may be careful to do all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and you will have success. That is similar to what Moses says when he is warning the people that they're going to have a king eventually. And he warns them, back in Deuteronomy, he says, the king needs to be meditating on it day and night. He instructs them to write his own law. Very similar, and in a way, it's really that leadership position, right? That Joshua is in. He's not a king, obviously, but very similar instructions are given. And so in the next part of chapter 1, you're going to see Joshua order the people, says, okay, get ready. In the next couple of days, we are going to leave Abel Shittim, and we are going to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land, into Canaan. Verse 11, he says, he basically passed through the midst of them, and he tells them to prepare, for within 3 days they're going to go into the land that God has given them. And you also have this discussion with Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh about going into the land. Do you remember why that is? It's because they have decided to... Yeah, they decided they're going to be on the east side of the Jordan, right? They're going to be on this side, so they have their possessions. But he's reminding them, he says, hey, you told Moses you're going to go into the land with us and fight, even though you've already had your possessions there. So they're going to leave their women and children and go and fight with the rest. To go for the 40,000 there? Into the Jordan, going into it, past that. You have any other comments? Okay, let's jump into chapter 2. Chapter 2, we're going to have, I think, the most familiar story of what we're going to be covering today. We have the story of the two spies and Rahab. It says in verse 1 that Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. And so they went and came to the house of a harlot whose name was Rahab and lodged there. Okay? I want you to think about this for a second, and we'll maybe circle around back to it, is what is the purpose of the visitation of the two spies? They do not really give any military advice on this of, let's circle around this way. What's the purpose of this visitation? Think about that as we kind of go through this. And so they are going to go to the house of Rahab, who is a harlot, a prostitute. And there are some people, Josephus is one of them, who has tried to call her an innkeeper as well, that she had some type of tavern or an innkeeper there on the city wall instead of a harlot. It could be a little bit of both. I don't know, but I know the New Testament does refer to her as a harlot, and so I do think that she was one of those as well. She might have had some type of where people would come in and stay, not only for prostitution. So we have that, and I think the reason why that some people have tried to take that away and say, she's not a harlot, she was an innkeeper, is because she, as we're going to see, is in the line of David and ultimately Christ, but you see that she's very prominent in that, and so they wouldn't want a harlot to be part of the lineage of David and the kings as well. I think the reason that they might choose a house like this, just thinking about the two spies going into her, is it's a place that you could kind of slip in easily to, right? It's if you're going to a house of a harlot, it's not going to be one that there's many questions asked. You're going to be able to get in and get out, a shady area, if you will. One of the writers I saw, some had even suggest that maybe they met her outside the city. They kind of knew of an area that people, women like that would be, and that they might have met her there and discussed where her house is, something like that. It's obviously not said in the text, but they are met. She meets them, and they go to her house, of course. So, verse 3, we have the king of Jericho sends word to Rahab, and he basically says, bring out these men who have come into your house. Now in verse 4, we'll just go ahead and read it. It says, but the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. It came about when it was about time to shut the gate at dark. The men went out, and I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. And in verse 6, we're told that she had brought them to the roof and hid them in the stalks of flax that she had on the roof there. Okay. The first thing I noticed there is that there is a king of Jericho. You're going to see this a lot of times in the invasion conquest, that they have all these little city-states have kings, right? There is no centralized government in the land of Canaan. The kings of the Amorites and the Canaanites, there's not a central government as there was in some of these great, mighty powers like Egypt, for example, Babylon. They do not have that here in the land of Canaan. And so we're going to have in this, let me back up and say, I know what you all are thinking when you kind of read this, and I bet it's being discussed, especially in the older children. Does God approve of the lie of Rahab? If you look that up on the internet, you're going to see everything. You're going to see people say that people are justified, that it's okay to lie at some points. You're going to see everything. Let me throw out this to you before, and then we'll see what others have to say about this. You know, obviously, God does not approve of dishonesty. You see that in the Ten Commandments. You see that with Christ. Dishonesty is not something that is to be tolerated. And it's clearly a lie. Some people have tried to rationalize this, that, she did not lie. She clearly lied. I mean, she said she didn't know where they're from. She knew where they're from. And she said they went out somewhere else. She's hiding them. Some people have said this is a very difficult situation she is put in, right? It's similar to the way that if you were in maybe Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s, and you suggested in, the Gestapo not, and you're hiding Jews, well, what are you going to say? You're going to say, well, you've caught me. Yeah, we have, 20, we're hiding 20 people in the basement. You're in between a rock and a hard place, right? I think it's a similar concept here. It's also similar to the way and not exactly, but similar to how the midwives, you remember back in Exodus 1, and the midwives give the excuse to Pharaoh saying that the Israelite women were quicker than they're more lively than the Egyptian women. And they're blessed for that. And I think really the way I would look at this is, I think she's praised, because she's praised later on. We see it in Hebrews, we see it in James. She's praised for her action in her faith. And that maybe the way she goes about handling this is not the exact right way that we would say needs to be done. But with the limited knowledge, remember, she is not an Israelite. She is a foreigner, an outsider, someone who had heard of these stories, but she's praised for that and what she does, but she has limited knowledge, right? And I think that's really where I kind of think about it, is that she does not have the law of Moses and the things that these other people have, and she acts off of the faith that she did have and her understanding of who these people were, and even though that she went about it in a way that we would disagree with, I think that's where we would really I think that's where what I would say to that, right, is that she goes about it kind of in a poor way, but she means well in it. I guess that's a bad way of saying that. Josh?
My thoughts were that she wasn't one of God's people at the time when she did this stuff, so she wasn't being held to all these things at that time.
Yeah, I think that's right. Is that she's not an Israelite. She's not being held to that standard of this that the Israelites would have been. You have anything else, Brent?
This parallel is not parallel in every respect, but it will illustrate something. In Acts 19, the town clerk, when he took up the goddess Diana, hey, we all know this image fell from Jupiter. God does not come take the account, does not come out and say, oh, by the way, everything the town clerk said is false. It's just simply a record of what happened. What we have in Genesis is just simply a record
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a good way of looking at it. Another of the writers that maybe we don't need to spend a whole lot of time condemning her or commending her on it, is what somebody says. Jonah?
God uses people who are not of his body many times to help fulfill his will. I mean, he doesn't have to approve of what they do, but they're a tool to achieve, the promises he's made to his people. Rahab's an example of that. The Assyrians taking them away, the Babylonians taking them away, are the people.
Yeah, you think of like Nebuchadnezzar, who has done a lot of evil, but he ends up doing what is God's will, even though he didn't realize it is that way. Those are good comments. Let's move forward with this now. Okay, so we've had this story. She's lied about this. Now, in verses 18 through 13, we have her speech, really. She is going to talk to them, and I read that this is not the longest speech by a woman in Scripture, but it is one of the longest ones. Looking in verse 9, it says, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you had came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And then she's going to go on and basically ask, hey, I have done good to you in hiding you. Please do good to me when you enter the land and save me and spare me, is what is going to happen. It's fascinating to me that she mentions the Red Sea crossing, Sihon and Og. They're hearing of these things that have happened, one 40 years ago, one very recently, I think within a couple months probably, of Sihon and Og. And our hearts melted before us. And that's really the concept here of why God has done all of these things, right? Of the Red Sea crossing, of all of these things. This dread is coming before, just come to the land. We're gonna see this again, I think, in somewhere in here, and I'll get to it, where it says the Amorites and the Canaanites have this dread as well of them. Do you appreciate how much faith Rahab had in this? Do you really appreciate it? And you think about this story. We've already mentioned she is in Hebrews 11 and in James, talking about her faith and the works that she had that was involved with that. She had heard of this God that had done these things. She had heard of it. She had not seen it. She was not an Israelite. She had not seen all the things that happened in the wandering in the wilderness. Yet she hides these spies. She really confesses her faith to them. And not only, the king of Jericho sent people to them, to her. And she, as we've already discussed about, hid the spies. Well, she risked her own life in doing so, right? She really does risk her life by hiding these spies. What if they had busted in and found the spies? Well, she would have been killed. No doubt would have been killed very easily like that. And then she also is going to plead with the spies and say, I'm hiding you. Please deal good to me and save my life. She doesn't know what the spies are going to say. What if the spies had said, yeah, that's nice that you did that, but you are a Canaanite, and we are not going to allow you to, your family, no one's going to be able to survive this. She didn't know what they were going to say, but her faith there really is displayed. And one of the other things I think of is I'm just so impressed. She's a harlot. She's a prostitute. Of all people in the Bible, she's the one, and she's mentioned, of all people that are put in Hebrews 11 about faith. You have all these great men of faith. You have a harlot that's put in there. And I just think about the power of God and when you have it with the gospel, you have it here with these stories that she had heard, realizing who God is and changing her life. And it doesn't exactly say whatever happened to her, except for the fact that she is in the lineage of Christ. She marries Salmon, I think. It's spelled like salmon, but we'll put it Salmon. And she's going to have Boaz, with Boaz and Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David, Solomon. You know, you have that, and she's in the lineage all the way down to Christ. And so you have a harlot that's there. I think that's just so really unbelievable how that is. Lorenzo? Yeah, that's a good point. Lorenzo said a lot of people have trouble with just having a complete genocide of the people, but this shows that it's really about following God, that she would have been. It's not about her nationality, but her faith in God really saves her there. Okay, let's continue on there. As we see, just check what I have. In verse 15, she lets them out as that scarlet cord, that very familiar story. And in verse 16, she tells them to go into the hill country. So if you kind of remember, I'll kind of go back to it, of where they are. They're in Jericho there. Towards the west, we have a lot of hill country. In fact, that's really, you remember the parable of the Samaritan? And it is between Jerusalem and Jericho. And I think one of the reasons why that is because it's a hilly area where there's a lot of caves and a lot of places to hide out with. I think that's the reason why Jesus puts that parable there. And it might give you kind of an idea of the type of country this is. They would be able to go towards the west there and hide out for a couple of days and not be found. Now, I want to go back to that original question I had about why were the spies sent. We're not told exactly. I think one of the reasons that it might be sent is because it's kind of a faith-building thing. They are going to go back to Joshua and say, here's what happened. We went here and Rahab says, our hearts melted. The people are afraid of us. They've heard these stories. And we're going to be able to go out and take them. In fact, that's what is said in verse 24 when they give that report. I think that's probably the reason why they are sent out in this way. And also, in doing so, in being sent out, they end up saving the life of Rahab and her family as well during this. So there are conditions to being saved. You know, they say that we will save you on 3 conditions. Those 3 conditions are you don't tell our business in verse 17, or in verse 20. You have to be in the house, be in your house. Everyone needs to be in your house in verse 19. And you need to have that scarlet cord that we have come down with, needs to be in your window during this. And so that's really the end of chapter 2, as we'll have to move on quickly through the rest of this. Okay, so in chapter 3, we're going to have the crossing of the Jordan River by the Israelites. Verse 4, we're told that they need to stand 2,000 cubits back from the Ark of the Covenant, and the priest that's carrying that. That's over half a mile is how far that is. Verse 7, we're told that the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that you may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. Okay, so then he commands the priest to move forward, and that they are going to go towards the Jordan River. The next part of this, we're going to have the priest bear the Ark of the Covenant with them, and they're going to put their feet in the river. At verse 13, it says that they put their feet there, or I guess he's predicting it and says that this is what's going to happen. And so in verse 15, we're told that those who carried the ark, that their feet of the priest carrying the ark were dipped in the edge of the water, that the water is going to stop. Okay? And it also tells us there at the end, it says, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest. Okay? So here's where we are, that we're crossing over. You kind of see a representation of the priest standing on dry ground. Now here is a good picture here of the Jordan River at normal times. You know, at a normal time, you could probably easily get across that. In fact, if you can see in this picture, there is a little bridge there. It's not much of a bridge, but you could get through that fairly easily. Now, at flood stage, and I think that this is the same exact area. Is that right, Steve? Okay. This is the exact same spot, and you see at the flood stage, I mean, it's like it's really, this whole, you can't even see a road at all, but it's really completely all flooded, and that's how it was when the Israelites crossed, is at that flood stage in that top picture there. And so as we move into chapter 4, we're going to have the memorial stones. It kind of keeps the story of them crossing the Jordan River. And so the Lord's going to commands Joshua, he says, get one man from each tribe, and you're going to get a stone out of the river. You're going to take it with us, and they're going to set this up at Gilgal, is where this is going to happen, at Gilgal. In verse 9, it also, we have the indication that that Joshua sets up 12 stones as well in the river itself. Some people have read that and say that the translation could kind of mean perhaps it's talking about the ones that are set up at Gilgal. But to me, it looks like a pretty clear indication that it was a different set of 12 stones that are set up there. And the purpose of both of these, of the one that's going to be at the Jordan River and the one at Gilgal, is going to be to remember. And when your children ask you, just like it is at the Passover, when your children ask you, what's the purpose of these stones, you're going to be able to tell them the story and tell them how God delivered them and has brought them into the land of Canaan. And that's really the whole purpose of this, for them to do that. I want you to look in verse 14. It says, verse 14 of chapter 4 says, on that day, okay, so they have crossed over. This is part of the crossing over. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, so that they revered him just as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. So this is very similar to the fact, and it's likened to it in verse 23 as well, to the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay, they're both, Moses crosses through water with the Red Sea. Joshua does the same thing with the Jordan River, and having them cross the Jordan River in this way. So it really solidifies him as their leader. The other thing, when I think about this, you're going to see this other times in Scripture later on in the divided kingdom, I think. Elijah is going to part the water, and so you have kind of, that's a way that you see somebody that is from God. He parts the water. Elisha is going to do the exact same thing as well. Later on, I think in 2 Kings 2, that's going to happen. Verse 19, we have that they cross over on the 10th day of the first month. So we are 4 days away from the Passover. And they're going to camp at Gilgal. That is where they are going to camp. So here it kind of gives you an idea of where we are. We have crossed over. If you drove a car in this, you're talking a matter of minutes to get from these places. But these are miles away from each other, but not a lot of miles. But when you have that many people trying to cross and things, it would take a long time for you to be able to cross and to get across the Jordan River. And so they're going to camp at Gilgal, kind of in this area here, is going to be at Gilgal, and they are going to stay there for a while. You see all the way into chapter 10, verse 43 of Joshua, that they are still at Gilgal. And I think that's really going to be their home base. That is base camp for the invasion and conquest, is I think kind of the idea there is where they set up, at least for a little while at least. So chapter 5, verse 1, that's what I was trying to reference earlier. It says that the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and the Canaanites who were all by the sea, when they heard the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel, it says that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit among them because of the sons of Israel. So we have this. Remember, the Amorites and the Canaanites are generic names for the people. He doesn't mention all the Perizzite and the Hivite and all these other Jebusite. Those are generic names for the people of the land. And they are in dread of the children of Israel when they hear of this next step that they've taken. Okay? And so in chapter 5, we're only going through verse 12. We have the story of the men being circumcised. And so God tells Joshua to get flint knives, and they're going to circumcise the people there. It says in verse 4, the reason why Joshua circumcised them, all the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. Okay, so they had not been circumcised. It's kind of interesting. There's been kind of talk about, well, why is it this way that they were not circumcised in the wilderness? And we're not really told, we're not exactly told the reason why. But here at Gilgal, they are going to be circumcised. And in verse 9, it says, the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So they named the place Gilgal, which means rolled away or rolling or something of that concept is what Gilgal means. And I don't think I have time to really go into it. I think really that they had not been circumcising the men there in the 40 years, and maybe that has to do with the fact that it has to do with the failure that older generation had to do, whether they did it that they just didn't do it because they didn't have faith, or perhaps some have suggested that God had instructed them not to in the wilderness. We're not told. But what they're doing here in being circumcised is removing that shame, that failure, the reproach of Egypt is what the Lord calls this as they are ready to go into the land. And I find it very interesting that they do this not on the plains of Moab. They do this in enemy territory. Okay? So if you think about that, and it says in verse 8 that they had to camp until they were healed. So they're in pain. They're not able to go out and fight for a couple of days. Well, you think about doing that logically. You would not do this in your enemy territory, right? You would not do this in a place that you could be attacked at any moment. Do you remember the story of, I think it's Simeon and Levi back in Genesis? And there's this story, I think it's at Shechem, with their sister Dinah and the men. You have this, and they basically says, hey, we want to be part of your group and marry, or something to that extent, marry her. And Simeon and Levi say, yeah, that's okay, but you're going to have to be circumcised first. That's kind of going to be our covenant. And so they do that. And while they are in pain and trying to heal, Simeon and Levi goes in and kills them all. And so it kind of gives you the idea here that this could happen to the Israelites. But I think this is an act of faith, knowing that God is there and He's going to protect them, even though they're in enemy territory. Steve?
I think there's a bit of connection between the circumcision of the males, which God set up with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, in direct connection to the land promise. If you read that, God promises the land, and the seal of that covenant is circumcision of the males. And so for them to renew that covenant right when they enter the promised land, I think is probably pretty significant connection.
Yeah, connection between the two. Yeah. Lorenzo? Yeah, it's a good point. It is kind of in reverse of what Moses does. Okay, as we kind of wrap up here, in verse 10, we're going to have them partake of the Passover. On the 14th day of the first month, they're going to partake of the Passover. And In verse 12, it says, the manna ceased on that day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land. So the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. So it's in this moment, and I think that kind of connects back over with the fact that the water is flooding, and it says that it's at the harvest time that this happens. And that would kind of make sense that this is why they're able to eat of the produce. It's ready to be eaten. And so they're able to do that, and at that moment, the manna is going to stop because they do not need it anymore. They are going to have the food of the land, the good food of the land, there to eat on. And that's really the end of the wandering in the wilderness, and really as far as I'm going to get to in this. Right, yeah. I don't know if you heard that. My dad was saying that. Basically, they have a responsibility, even though they're told to go into the land, to have to prepare and do these things. As we are today with teaching, we can't just say, okay, we are just going to teach, but you have to be prepared to be able to teach these things and have a plan with that. And that's a good point as we end that talking about the spies. You have anything else, Brent?
Just think about Rahab being like an illustration of Romans 1, 16 to 17. Romans 1, 16 to 17, the gospel, it is God's power to save. And then the just shall live by faith. So we hear the gospel, believe it, but we've got to let it move us. Rahab, back in Joshua 2, when we heard what the Lord did at the Jordan and with the kings, our hearts melted. They heard the facts, but then she said, say, show grace in my house. So she let the facts move her. The powers of the gospel, not in our estimation of who we're talking to. God's word is what is the power. And she's an example of letting the facts, the truth, move her to action.
Yeah, that's a great point. Rahab does allow that. And one thing I find even more interesting about the fact that she is an outsider and had not seen any of the things, as we kind of mentioned before, she had not seen any of that happen. Unlike those Israelites who had seen, that generation before that's not going into the land because of their disbelief. She had heard these things and she believed it. She says, hey, I want to be saved. Unlike the generation before of those Israelites who had seen all of those great things of the 10 plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea. Anything else? Okay, thank you.